The golden chandelier cast warm light across the marble floor of the Grand Palace Hotel. It was the kind of place where money talked louder than words, and tonight was no different. Rich people in expensive clothes walked around the lobby, their jewelry catching the light as they laughed and chatted about their latest business deals. In the center of it all sat a beautiful black piano. It wasn't just any piano. It was a 100-year-old Steinway that looked like a piece of art. The wood was so shiny you could see your reflection in it. But there was something special about this piano that most people didn't know. It was famous for being impossible to play properly. Robert Davidson walked through the lobby like he owned the world. And in many ways he did. His family owned this hotel and 20 others just like it. At 35, he had never worked a real day in his life. Money had always been there, handed to him on a silver plate. Tonight, he wore a suit that cost more than most people made in a month. Walking beside him was his girlfriend, Catherine. She came from money too, but unlike Robert, she sometimes wondered if there was more to life than shopping and fancy parties. Her blonde hair was perfect, her dress was designer, and her smile was practiced. But if you looked closely, you might see a hint of sadness in her blue eyes. "Darling, did you know that piano hasn't been played properly in 15 years? Catherine said, pointing at the beautiful instrument. "The hotel manager told me earlier, something about the keys being too sensitive or the sound being off." Robert laughed, but it wasn't a kind laugh. "That's because these people don't know real talent when they see it. I bet I could play it perfectly if I wanted to. But why would I waste my time on something like that?" Near the back wall, a man, in his 50s, quietly mopped the floor. His name was David, and he had been working as a janitor at the hotel for 3 years. People barely noticed him. He was just part of the background, like the furniture or the paintings on the wall. But David had a secret that would shock everyone in that room. He wore the same blue uniform every day, with his name tag slightly crooked. His hands were rough from years of cleaning, and his hair was starting to turn gray. But when David looked at that piano, something magical happened in his eyes. It was like seeing an old friend after a long time apart. David had been listening to Robert and Catherine talk about the piano. He remembered when the famous pianist Maria Delacroix had donated it to the hotel. She was his teacher many years ago, in what felt like another lifetime. Every day for 3 years he had cleaned around that piano, never touching it, never letting anyone know his secret. "You know what would be funny?" Robert said loudly, making sure everyone nearby could hear him. "What if we had a little contest? Anyone who can make that old piano sound good wins a prize." A small crowd began to gather. Rich people loved entertainment, especially when it involved watching someone fail. Catherine looked uncomfortable, but she didn't say anything. She had learned that arguing with Robert in public only made things worse. "What kind of prize?" asked Mr. Thompson, an old man who owned several restaurants in the city. Robert's eyes lit up with mischief. "How about this? If anyone here can play that piano and make it sound like real music, I'll marry them right here, right now." He laughed at his own joke. Of course, that would mean calling off my engagement to beautiful Catherine here, but a bet is a bet. The crowd laughed along with him. Catherine's face turned red, but she forced a smile. She was used to Robert making jokes at her expense, but this one felt particularly cruel. "Even the hotel staff can try," Robert continued, gesturing toward David, who was quietly cleaning nearby. "Come on, anyone at all. Let's see if we can find some hidden talent in this place." David's hand stopped moving on the mop handle. For a moment, the noise of the lobby seemed to fade away. He could hear, his heart beating in his chest. The piano called to him like it had every day for 3 years, but tonight felt different. "What's wrong, my friend?" Robert called out to David, his voice dripping with fake friendliness. "Don't tell me you're shy. Come on, give us a little concert." The crowd turned to look at David. Some people giggled, others whispered to each other. They saw a simple janitor, a man who probably never had a music lesson in his life. How could he possibly play such a beautiful, complicated instrument? David looked at the piano, then at the crowd, then back at the piano. His wife's voice echoed in his memory. "Music isn't about showing off, David. It's about sharing your heart with the world." She had said that to him 20 years ago, when they were young and everything seemed possible. But that was before the accident. Before everything changed. Before he lost everything that mattered and had to start over with nothing but the clothes on his back and hands that remembered how to clean but tried to forget how to play. "I don't think he speaks English very well," Robert said with a smirk. "Maybe he doesn't understand what we're talking about." Catherine finally spoke up. "Robert, maybe we should just leave him alone. He's trying to work." "Oh, come on, Kathy. Don't be such a spoilsport. We're just having a little fun, aren't we, friend?" Robert walked over to David and patted him on the shoulder like he was a pet. "Nothing to be embarrassed about. Not everyone can be talented." The words hit David harder than they should have. For 3 years he had listened to comments like this. People assumed that because he cleaned floors, he must not be smart. Because he wore a uniform with someone else's name on it, he must not have dreams or memories or a past that mattered. But tonight, with that piano sitting there like an old friend waiting for him to come home, David felt something crack inside his chest. It wasn't anger exactly. It was more like a door that had been locked for years suddenly deciding it was time to open. David set down his mop and walked slowly toward the piano. The crowd went quiet, not sure what was happening. Robert's smile got bigger, thinking he was about to watch a man embarrass himself for everyone's entertainment. Catherine watched David's face as he got closer to the piano. Something about the way he moved reminded her of the way her grandfather used to approach his violin. With respect, almost like he was approaching something holy. David reached the piano bench and stopped. He looked at the keys, pristine white, and black rectangles that hadn't felt the touch of a real musician in years. His hands, scarred and rough from years of hard work, trembled slightly. "This should be good," Robert whispered to someone nearby, loud enough for everyone to hear. David sat down on the bench and adjusted it slightly, the way a real pianist would. The crowd started to murmur. Maybe this wouldn't be as funny as they thought. Maybe this janitor actually knew something about pianos. But David just sat there, not moving, not playing. His hands rested on his knees as he stared at the keys. The seconds ticked by and the crowd started to get restless. "Having second thoughts?" Robert called out. "It's okay. No one will judge you for backing down." But David wasn't backing down. He was remembering. He was thinking about the first time he sat at a piano, when he was 7 years old and his grandmother saved for months to pay for lessons. He was thinking about the day he got accepted to music school and how his parents cried with joy. He was thinking about the night he met Elena at a concert and how she said his playing made her believe in magic. Most of all, he was thinking about the last time he played, the night before the accident that took everything away. David closed his eyes and let his hands rise slowly toward the keys. The crowd held its breath. Even Robert stopped smiling, sensing that something unexpected was about to happen. When David's fingers finally touched the piano keys, the first note that came out was soft and pure, like a question being asked in the most beautiful language in the world. The old Steinway responded to his touch like it had been waiting for him all this time. The second note followed, then a third, and suddenly, David wasn't a janitor anymore. He wasn't a man who had lost everything. He was a musician, sitting at his instrument ready to share his heart with a room full of strangers who had no idea what they were about to hear. The real show was about to begin. The first few notes from the piano floated across the lobby like whispers. David's fingers moved carefully over the keys, testing each one like he was greeting an old friend he hadn't seen in years. The Steinway responded with sound so pure and clear that even the people who knew nothing about music could tell something special was happening. Robert's confident smile started to fade. This wasn't going the way he had planned. The janitor was supposed to hit a few wrong notes, make everyone laugh, and then walk away embarrassed. Instead, the man at the piano was producing music that made the expensive lobby feel like a concert hall. Lucky guess, Robert muttered to himself, but his voice wasn't as loud as before. David's hands found their rhythm as muscle memory took over. It had been 15 years since he last touched a piano, but his fingers remembered what his mind had tried to forget. The melody he chose was simple at first, a gentle piece that his grandmother had taught him when he was a child. But even this simple song sounded magical coming from the old Steinway. The crowd had stopped talking completely. Hotel guests who had been walking through the lobby stopped where they were. The staff behind the front desk came out to listen. Even the kitchen workers peeked through the doorway to see what was happening. Catherine found herself moving closer, to the piano. She had heard plenty of music in her life. Her parents had dragged her to opera houses and symphony halls since she was young. But this was different. This music had heart in it, real emotion that reached out and touched something inside her chest. "He's just playing some simple tune," Robert said, but his voice sounded nervous now. Anyone could do that. Mrs. Henderson, an elderly woman who had been staying at the hotel for a week, shook her head. "Young man, I've been listening to piano music for 70 years. That is not just anyone playing." David's hands began to move faster, and the simple melody grew into something more complex. He was starting to remember not just how to play, but why he had loved it so much. Music had always been his way of talking to the world when regular words weren't enough. The piano seemed to come alive under his touch. Notes that had been stuck for years suddenly rang out clear and true. The old instrument had been waiting for someone who understood its language, someone who could coax the music out instead of forcing it. Robert's face was getting red. This was supposed to be his show, his joke, his moment to make fun of someone else. But instead, everyone was staring at the janitor like he was some kind of wizard. "Okay, that's enough," Robert said loudly, trying to break the spell. "Very nice, very impressive. But I think we've all heard enough amateur hour for one evening." David didn't stop playing. In fact, he was just getting started. The simple melody transformed into something that made people's hearts beat faster. His left hand found the bass notes while his right hand danced across the higher keys, creating a conversation between low and high that told a story without words. Catherine moved even closer. She could see David's face now, and what she saw there took her breath away. This wasn't a man showing off or trying to win a bet. This was someone sharing a piece of his soul with a room full of strangers. Tears started to form in David's eyes, but he didn't stop playing. The music was bringing back memories he had buried deep inside. He remembered Elena sitting beside him at their piano at home, singing along while he played. He remembered their daughter Lisa clapping her tiny hands and asking him to play the pretty song over and over again. The melody changed again, becoming something sadder, but also more beautiful. It was the song he had been composing for Elena, the one he never got to finish because the accident happened first. For 15 years, those unfinished notes had haunted his dreams. But now, sitting at this piano, the ending came to him naturally. "Sir, perhaps you should stop now," Robert said, walking toward the piano. He couldn't let this continue. People were looking at the janitor with admiration, and they were looking at Robert like he was the fool in this situation. But before Robert could reach the piano, an old man stepped out from the crowd. He was well-dressed, but not flashy, with white hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. Professor Williams had been the music director at the hotel for 20 years, and he knew real talent when he heard it. "Don't you dare interrupt him," Professor Williams said firmly, putting his hand on Robert's arm. "Do you have any idea what you're witnessing?" "I'm witnessing some janitor making noise on an expensive piano," Robert shot back. "And I'm the one who's going to have to pay if he breaks something." Professor Williams shook his head. "That janitor is playing Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, one of the most difficult pieces ever written, and he's playing it from memory, without sheet music, on a piano that most professional musicians can't even tune properly." The crowd gasped. Even Catherine, who had grown up around classical music, knew that name. Chopin was the kind of composer that only serious musicians attempted to play. David's performance was reaching its peak now. His whole body swayed with the music as his hands flew across the keys. The Steinway sang like it hadn't sung in years, every note perfect and clear and full of emotion that made people in the crowd wipe their eyes. Robert felt like the walls were closing in on him. This was his hotel, his crowd, his night to be the center of attention. How had some nobody in a janitor's uniform managed to steal his spotlight so completely? "Fine," Robert said loudly, interrupting the music. Very impressive. You've had your fun, but let's not forget why we're here. This was supposed to be a joke, not a concert. David's hand slowed but didn't stop. He looked up at Robert for the first time since he had started playing. His eyes were wet with tears. But there was something else there, too. A strength that Robert hadn't expected to see. You said if anyone could play this piano, you would marry them, David said quietly. His voice was rough from years of staying silent, but his words were clear. Are you a man of your word? The crowd laughed, but it wasn't the kind of laughter Robert had wanted. They were laughing at him now, not with him. Catherine looked embarrassed, and Robert felt his control of the situation slipping away completely. That was obviously a joke, Robert said, forcing a laugh. I mean, come on, be realistic here. Sounded like a promise to me, called out Mrs. Henderson. Quite a few witnesses here, too. David's hands found the keys again, and he began to play something new. This piece was even more beautiful than the last one, full of hope and sadness, and love all mixed together. It was the lullaby he used to play for Lisa when she couldn't sleep, the one Elena had hummed while she cooked dinner. Stop, Robert said, his voice getting desperate now. Just stop playing, this is ridiculous. But David couldn't stop, even if he wanted to. The music was pouring out of him like water from a broken dam. For 15 years he had kept all of this locked inside, afraid that playing again would hurt too much. But now he realized that not playing had hurt even more. Catherine watched Robert's face as he struggled to deal with a situation he couldn't control with money or threats. For the first time since she had known him, she was seeing who he really was underneath all the charm and expensive clothes. And she didn't like what she saw. The music filled every corner of the lobby, touching hearts and bringing back memories for everyone who listened. This wasn't just entertainment anymore. This was something real and powerful and true. And David was just getting started. The music that flowed from David's fingers transformed the entire hotel lobby. What had started as Robert's cruel joke had become something magical that no one wanted to end. The old Steinway piano responded to David's touch like it had been sleeping for years and was finally waking up. David's performance grew more intense with each passing minute. His hands moved across the keys with the confidence of someone who had spent decades learning their secrets. The difficult passages that would challenge even professional pianists seemed effortless under his touch. But it wasn't just technical skill that amazed the crowd. It was the raw emotion that poured out with every note. Catherine found herself crying without knowing why. The music spoke to something deep inside her that she had forgotten existed. All her life, she had been surrounded by beautiful things that meant nothing. Designer clothes, expensive jewelry, fancy cars. They were all just objects. But this music was real in a way that made everything else seem fake. Robert watched in growing panic as his perfectly planned evening fell apart. The crowd that should have been laughing at his joke was instead staring at the janitor with wonder and respect. Worse, they were looking at Robert like he was the villain in this story. Enough, Robert shouted, his voice cutting through the music. This has gone on long enough. I own this hotel and I'm telling you to stop playing right now. David's hands paused on the keys. The sudden silence felt heavy and uncomfortable. Everyone turned to look at Robert, who was red-faced and breathing hard like he had been running. You're disturbing our guests, Robert continued, trying to regain control. This lobby is for hotel business, not for free concerts by the cleaning staff. An uncomfortable murmur went through the crowd. Mrs. Henderson stepped forward, her cane tapping against the marble floor. Young man, she said to Robert, her voice sharp with disapproval. I have been a guest at fine hotels around the world for 40 years. I have never been more entertained or moved than I have been tonight. If anyone is disturbing the peace, it's you. Several other guests nodded in agreement. Robert felt the situation slipping further away from him. This was supposed to be simple. Make fun of the janitor, get some laughs, and move on with the evening. Instead, he had somehow become the bad guy in his own story. David looked down at his hands resting on the piano keys. For a moment, the old fear came back. Maybe Robert was right. Maybe he should just go back to his mop and bucket and pretend none of this had happened. It would be easier that way. Safer. But then he heard a small voice from the crowd. "Please don't stop, mister." That was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard. David looked up and saw a little girl, maybe 8 years old, standing next to what must have been her parents. She had blonde hair and pigtails and big brown eyes that reminded him painfully of Lisa. The child's face was full of wonder, like she had just witnessed real magic. "Play some more," the little girl said. "Please?" David felt his heart break and heal at the same time. This was why he had learned to play music in the first place, not for fame or money or applause, but for moments like this. Music was a gift that was meant to be shared, especially with children who still believed in magic. "I think I will," David said quietly, and his hands found the keys again. This time he played something different. It was a piece he had written himself many years ago, back when he thought his future was full of concerts and recordings and all the success a musician could want. The melody was complex but joyful, telling the story of hope and dreams and all the good things that could happen in life. Robert made a move toward the piano, but Professor Williams stepped in front of him. "Touch that man while he's playing, and you'll answer to me," the old music director said. Despite his age, there was steel in his voice that made Robert back down. "Do you know who I am?" Robert demanded. "This is my hotel." Professor Williams studied Robert's face carefully. "I know exactly who you are. You're a spoiled young man who has never had to work for anything in his life. You think money makes you better than other people, but tonight you're learning that some things can't be bought." The crowd around them had grown even larger. Hotel staff members were abandoning their posts to listen. Guests from the upper floors had come down to see what the commotion was about. Even people walking by on the street were stopping to peer through the large windows. David's music filled the space like light filling a dark room. Each note was perfect, placed exactly where it needed to be to create something beautiful. But more than that, the music told stories. You could hear laughter in some passages, sadness in others, and always love running underneath it all. Catherine watched David's face as he played. She had known Robert for 2 years, and in all that time, she had never seen him show this kind of passion about anything. Robert cared about money and status and being seen at the right parties with the right people. But David cared about something deeper, something that made his eyes shine and his whole body come alive. "Catherine," Robert said, grabbing her arm. "We're leaving. This is embarrassing." Catherine looked at Robert's hand on her arm, then at his angry face, then at David sitting peacefully at the piano, lost in his music. For the first time, she saw the two men clearly, really saw them. "Let go of me," she said quietly. "What?" "I said let go of me." Catherine pulled her arm free. "I want to listen to the music." Robert's mouth fell open. Catherine had never talked to him like that before. She had always been quiet and agreeable, going along with whatever he wanted to do. This was not part of his plan. The music changed. Again, becoming something that seemed to tell the story of loss and grief and learning to hope again. David's whole body swayed with the melody as his fingers found notes that seemed impossible to reach. The old piano sang like it was young again, every sound clear and true and full of life. Professor Williams moved closer to the piano, his eyes wide with recognition and growing excitement. He had heard thousands of pianists over the years, students and professionals and amateurs. But this was something special. This was the kind of playing that only came from someone who had lived through real pain and real joy and learned to put it all into music. As David reached the climax of the piece, his hands flying across the keys in passages that would challenge any concert pianist, Professor Williams gasped. "My God," he whispered, "I know who you are." The words were quiet, but in the silence between musical phrases, several people heard them. David's playing faltered for just a moment, his eyes meeting. The old professors across the piano. "You're David Mitchell," Professor Williams said louder now. "You're David Mitchell." A shock went through the crowd. Even people who didn't know much about classical music had heard that name. David Mitchell had been one of the most promising young pianists in the world before he disappeared from the music scene 15 years ago. David's hand stopped moving. The sudden silence was deafening. For a moment he looked like he might run away, might grab his mop and bucket and disappear back into the invisible world of janitors and maintenance workers. But the little girl with the pigtails spoke up again. "Are you famous?" she asked with the honesty that only children possess. David looked at her, then at the crowd of people staring at him with new understanding. Famous. He had been once, but that felt like someone else's life now. "I used to be," he said simply. The truth was finally out. The janitor who cleaned their floors every day was actually one of the most talented musicians any of them had ever heard. And Robert, who had started this whole thing as a joke, was standing there with his mouth open, realizing that his cruel game had just backfired in the worst possible way. But the real story was just beginning. The silence in the lobby was broken only by the sound of people whispering David's name to each other. David Mitchell, the pianist who had disappeared from the music world 15 years ago, leaving behind a promising career and thousands of fans who wondered what had happened to him. Professor Williams approached the piano slowly, his eyes filled with tears. "David, I attended your concert at Carnegie Hall in 2008. You played Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 with the New York Philharmonic. It was the most beautiful performance I had ever heard. I've been wondering what happened to you ever since." David's hands trembled as they rested on the piano keys. Being recognized was his worst fear, and his deepest wish all rolled into one moment. For 15 years he had hidden from his past, convinced that the world was better off without him. But sitting here now, feeling the music flow through him again, he wondered if he had been wrong. "I stopped playing," David said simply, his voice barely above a whisper. "But why?" asked Mrs. Henderson, who had moved closer to hear better. "You had such a gift." David closed his eyes, and for a moment he was back in his old life. He could see Elena's smile as she listened to him practice, could hear Lisa's giggles as she tried to play along on her tiny toy piano. That life felt like a beautiful dream now, something too good to have been real. "I lost my family," David said, opening his eyes but staring down at the keys. "Car accident. My wife and daughter were killed and I was injured. When I woke up in the hospital, I couldn't imagine making music in a world where they weren't there to hear it." The crowd went completely silent. Even Robert stopped looking angry and just looked shocked. This wasn't the story anyone had expected to hear. Catherine felt her heart break for this man who had suffered so much loss. She looked at Robert, expecting to see some sympathy on his face, but instead saw him calculating how to use this information to his advantage. "Well, that's very sad," Robert said, his voice lacking any real warmth. "But it doesn't change the fact that this is inappropriate behavior for hotel staff. Tragic backstory or not, you're still just the janitor here." The crowd turned to stare at Robert in disbelief. Professor Williams looked like he wanted to hit him with his cane. Even Catherine stepped away from her fiancé, embarrassed to be associated with him. "Actually," said a voice from the back of the crowd, "he's not just the janitor here." Everyone turned to see who had spoken. A tall woman in her 60s walked forward, dressed in an elegant business suit. This was Mrs. Patricia Vanderberg, the hotel's owner and Robert's grandmother. She had been watching from the mezzanine level, but David's music had drawn her down to see what was happening. "Grandmother?" Robert said, suddenly looking nervous. "I didn't know you were here tonight." "Clearly," Mrs. Vanderberg said dryly. She walked past Robert without another glance and approached David at the piano. "Mr. Mitchell, isn't it? I should have recognized you sooner, but it's been many years." David stood up from the piano bench looking confused. "I'm sorry. Have we met?" Mrs. Vanderberg smiled sadly. "Not directly, no. But I knew your teacher, Maria Delacroix. She was my dearest friend for 40 years before she passed away 5 years ago. This piano belonged to her. She donated it to the hotel in her will along with a letter. She reached into her purse and pulled out an envelope that had yellowed with age. Maria left specific instructions that this piano was to be kept in perfect condition, waiting for someone worthy to play it. She mentioned a former student of hers, someone special who had disappeared from the music world. She hoped that someday he might find his way back to music through this piano. David's legs felt weak. He sat back down on the piano bench heavily. Maria left this for me? She never stopped believing you would play again, Mrs. Vanderberg said gently. She told me once that real musicians don't retire, they just take long breaks between songs. Tears started flowing down David's cheeks openly now. Maria had been more than a teacher to him. She had been like a second mother, encouraging him when he doubted himself, celebrating his successes, and grieving with him after the accident. He had been too ashamed to see her after he stopped playing, and now it was too late. She died believing I would come back, David said, his voice breaking. But I let her down. No, Mrs. Vanderberg said firmly. You just came back at exactly the right time. Maria always said that music happens when it's supposed to happen, not when we think it should. Robert watched this conversation with growing alarm. His carefully constructed world was falling apart around him. First, the janitor had turned out to be a famous pianist, and now his own grandmother was treating the man like royalty. Grandmother, can we discuss this privately? Robert tried to interrupt. I think there's been some confusion here. Mrs. Vanderberg finally looked at her grandson, and her expression was not kind. The only confusion here, Robert, is how I raised a grandson who thinks cruelty is entertainment. I heard what you said to Mr. Mitchell, and I'm ashamed of you. The crowd was watching this family drama unfold with fascination. Catherine felt mortified to be associated with Robert, who was being dressed down by his own grandmother in front of dozens of witnesses. Mr. Mitchell, Mrs. Vanderberg continued, turning back to David, I would like to offer you a position as the hotel's resident musician. This piano belongs with someone who can bring out its true voice, and clearly, that someone is you. David looked up at her in shock. I don't know what to say. Say yes, called out the little girl with pigtails. Say yes, so you can play more pretty music. The crowd laughed, but it was warm laughter now, full of encouragement and hope. David looked around at all these faces, strangers who had become an audience, people who had listened to his music and found something in it that moved them. I haven't performed for an audience in 15 years, David said uncertainly. You just performed for an audience tonight, Professor Williams pointed out. And it was magnificent. Catherine stepped forward, surprising everyone, including herself. Mr. Mitchell, I don't know much about music, but I know that what you played tonight was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard. It made me feel things I didn't know I could feel. The world needs more beauty like that. She turned to look at Robert, who was standing there red-faced and speechless. And the world needs fewer people who think other people's pain is funny. With that, Catherine pulled off her engagement ring and handed it back to Robert. I can't marry someone who has so little kindness in their heart. Tonight showed me who you really are, and it's not someone I want to spend my life with. Robert's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. Catherine, you can't be serious. You're going to leave me for a janitor? I'm not leaving you for anyone, Catherine said calmly. I'm leaving you for myself. Tonight I remembered what it feels like to be moved by something real and beautiful. I want more of that in my life, and less of this. She gestured at Robert's angry, confused face. Mrs. Vanderberg watched her grandson's humiliation with a mixture of sadness and satisfaction. Robert, you made a promise tonight in front of all these witnesses. You said you would marry anyone who could play this piano properly. Are you a man of your word or not? The crowd waited to see what Robert would say. His face went through several different emotions: anger, embarrassment, panic, and finally, defeat. That was obviously a joke, Robert said weakly. No one could seriously expect a joke, Mrs. Vanderberg repeated. Yes, Robert, you are quite good at those. Unfortunately, you're not very good at much else. She turned back to David, who was still sitting at the piano, overwhelmed by everything that had happened. Mr. Mitchell, you don't have to give me an answer tonight about the job offer, but I hope you'll consider it. Music like yours deserves to be heard. David looked down at the piano keys, then up at the crowd of people who had listened to him play. For the first time in 15 years, he felt like maybe, just maybe, he could find a way to live with music in his life again. The night was far from over, but already everything had changed. 3 months had passed since that unforgettable night in the hotel lobby. The story had spread far beyond the Grand Palace Hotel. Newspapers had picked it up, social media had shared it, and suddenly everyone wanted to know about the janitor, who turned out to be a master pianist. David stood in his new apartment looking out the window at the city below. It wasn't a fancy place, but it was clean and comfortable, and most importantly, it had room for the upright piano that Mrs. Van der Berg had given him. The morning sunlight streamed through the windows, making the piano keys shine like they were smiling. He had accepted the job as the hotel's resident musician, though it had taken him weeks to work up the courage to say yes. The first few performances had been terrifying. His hands shook, his heart raced, and he forgot how to breathe properly. But slowly, note by note, he was remembering not just how to play, but how to live with music as part of his life again. Kyo. Phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. It was Professor Williams calling with news about the day's schedule. "David, I hope you're ready for this afternoon," the old professor said. "We have 30 children coming for the music program, and they're all incredibly excited to meet you." David smiled. The children's music program had been Catherine's idea. After she had broken up with Robert, she had approached David about starting a music education program for kids who couldn't afford lessons. David had been hesitant at first. He wasn't sure he was ready to teach. But the first time he saw a child's face light up when they played their first correct note on the piano, he knew he had found his purpose. "I'm ready," David said, and he meant it. The program met in the hotel's conference room, which had been converted into a music classroom. Mrs. Van der Berg had donated several keyboards and other instruments, and local music stores had contributed supplies. But the real magic happened when David sat down with the children and showed them that music wasn't about being perfect. It was about expressing what was in your heart. That afternoon, David walked into the classroom to find 30 excited faces waiting for him. These weren't wealthy children from families who could afford private lessons. These were kids from the community center, from local schools, from families who worked hard just to make ends meet. Many of them had never touched a musical instrument before David's program started. "Mr. David," called out a boy named Tommy who had been coming to classes for 2 months. "I practiced the song you taught us. Want to hear?" David's heart warmed as he watched Tommy's small fingers find the right keys on the keyboard. The boy's version of "Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star" wasn't perfect, but it was full of joy and pride. That was worth more than any perfect performance. "That was beautiful, Tommy," David said, and he meant it. Music isn't about playing every note exactly right. It's about putting your feelings into the sounds you make. A little girl named Sophia raised her hand. "Mr. David, will you play the sad, happy song again? The one that makes my mama cry, but in a good way?" David knew which piece she meant. It was the lullaby he had written for Lisa, the one he had been afraid to play for so many years. Now it had become one of the children's favorites, and playing it for them felt like sharing a gift instead of reopening a wound. As David's fingers found the familiar melody, the room fell quiet. Even the most energetic children sat still when he played, sensing that something special was happening. The music filled the space with warmth and love, and David could feel Elena and Lisa's presence in the room, approving of what he was doing. When the song ended, Sophia clapped her hands together. "It sounds like a hug, Mr. David." "That's exactly what it is," David said softly. After the children's class ended, David walked back to the hotel lobby where he would perform his evening concert. It had become a tradition now. Every night at 8 o'clock, David would play for an hour in the lobby. The hotel was always packed during these performances, with people coming from all over the city just to hear him play. Tonight was special, though. Catherine had arranged for a surprise guest. As David sat down at the Steinway piano, He noticed an elderly woman in the front row who looked familiar. She had kind eyes and silver hair, and she was watching him with an expression of deep emotion. "Ladies and gentlemen," Catherine announced to the crowd, "before tonight's performance begins, I'd like you to meet someone special. This is Mrs. Elena Rodriguez, and she has traveled here all the way from Spain." David's hands froze above the piano keys. Elena Rodriguez. That had been his wife's maiden name, but surely it was just a coincidence. The elderly woman stood up, slowly, and smiled at David. "Hello, nephew," she said in accented English. "I have been looking for you for a very long time." David's world spun around him. Elena's Aunt Rosa, whom he had met only once, many years ago at his wedding. She looked older now, but her eyes were the same warm brown as Elena's had been. "Aunt Rosa?" David whispered, his voice barely audible. "Elena told me that if anything ever happened to her, I should find you and make sure you were still making music," Rosa said, walking closer to the piano. "It took me many years to track you down, but when I saw the news stories about the pianist who disappeared and then came back, I knew it had to be you." David stood up from the piano bench, his legs shaking. He hadn't spoken to anyone from Elena's family since the funeral. The grief had been too overwhelming, and he had cut himself off from everyone who reminded him of what he had lost. "Elena loved your music more than anything," Rosa continued. "She used to call me after your concerts, so excited and proud. She would say, 'Aunt Rosa, David played like an angel tonight. I am the luckiest woman in the world.'" Tears were streaming down David's face now. But for the first time in 15 years, they weren't tears of pure sadness. They were mixed with something else: gratitude, love, and the beginning of healing. "She would be so proud of what you're doing now," Rosa said, gesturing toward the crowd that had gathered to hear him play. "Teaching children, sharing your gift with the world again. This is what she would have wanted for you." David wiped his eyes and looked out at the audience. There were families with children, elderly couples holding hands, young people who had discovered classical music through his performances. In the back, he could see some of his students from the children's program with their parents, excited to hear their teacher play for the adults. "I thought I was dishonoring their memory by playing again," David said quietly. "Oh, my dear boy," Rosa said, reaching up to touch his cheek. "You were dishonoring their memory by not playing. Elena used to say that your music was how you talked to God. She wouldn't want you to stop talking." David sat back down at the piano, his hands finding the keys with new purpose. Tonight, he would play for Elena and Lisa, but also for all the people who had gathered to listen. He would play for the children who were learning that music could be a friend when they felt alone. He would play for Mrs. Vanderberg, who had given him a second chance. He would play for Catherine, who had chosen kindness over comfort. He would even play for Robert wherever he was, hoping that someday he might learn that real wealth comes from lifting others up, not tearing them down. As the first notes of Chopin's Ballade No. 1 filled the lobby, David felt something shift inside his chest. The music wasn't bringing back the pain anymore, it was transforming it into something beautiful. Each note carried love instead of loss, hope instead of despair. The audience listened in reverent silence as David poured his heart into the performance. This wasn't just entertainment, it was a man sharing his journey from darkness back into light, using the only language that could fully express what he had been through. When the final notes faded away, the silence lasted for several long moments before the applause began. But David barely heard it. He was looking up at the ceiling, imagining Elena and Lisa somewhere beyond it, smiling and clapping along. "Thank you," he whispered, so quietly that only the piano could hear him. 6 months later, David released his first album in 16 years, titled Coming Home. Half the proceeds went to music education programs for underprivileged children. The album topped the classical music charts and reminded the world why David Mitchell had been considered one of the most promising pianists of his generation. But for David, the real success wasn't measured in album sales or concert reviews. It was measured in the little girl who learned to play Happy Birthday for her grandmother, in the teenager who discovered that music could help him express feelings he didn't have words for, and in his own gradual return to a life filled with purpose and joy. Every evening, as he sat down at the Steinway piano in the hotel lobby, David remembered that night when Robert's cruel joke had accidentally led him back to himself. Sometimes the best things in life come from the worst intentions, and sometimes losing everything is the only way to find out what really matters. The music played on, and David was finally truly home.